One of my favorite things to do is to surf at a beach that takes quite a bit of a walk. And it seems these days every single person has an e-bike. And being in what's called functional neurology, which is a subset of functional medicine. My name is Scott, and I've been 30 years in this industry. I've primarily treated brain injuries and stroke victims, but my scope of neurologic practice has increased to other areas. And I think it's absolutely invaluable information to share with you, not just about e-bikes and head injuries, but a term that may be somewhat new to people. Almost everyone has heard of what is called a leaky gut, but we are now starting to see what is called a leaky brain. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a traumatic brain injury or a stroke to develop a leaky brain. And so, what is it? What does it do to you? What are the dangers of e-bikes and some of the other things that cause a hit to the head, especially in today's environment? But most importantly, how do you know if you have it and what can you do about it? So I hope you really enjoy this video. And there are some true golden nuggets throughout this video. I don't normally, although I'm new at doing a lot of these videos, urge people to watch it all the way through. But this is filled with some new invaluable information that just really hasn't broken out into the public domain yet. Um, this will be the new leaky gut, which is leaky brain. So e-bikes are associated with higher rates of head injuries than traditional bicycles, and they're often more serious head injury rates. It's absolutely important, and I want to get into this because a lot of people, when they think of a head injury, they think I have a head injury, I'm going to recover. But a lot of people don't. And with the environment that we're dealing with today and the toxic overexposure, and as I explain a little bit of how these both kind of come together, I think you're going to see that the cause and the reason for the increase in mental health in the US and globally really has to do was with some extreme toxic exposure. And then you're combining it with some of these activities now, like e-bikes and cell phones and other things that are causing people to have head injuries. Still, 50% of head injuries are from auto accidents, but you're going to be absolutely surprised at e-bikes. And I watch these kids go flying by me at 20 miles an hour on their phones with their surfboards and have watched some spills. And sure enough, a lot of them end up seeing me at some point. Um, but why are e-bikes more likely to have a severe head injury than a traditional bicycle? It's merely that they're more there's less concentration when they're on an e-bike, but really most important is the speed at which they're traveling, which is about 20 miles per hour. And I want to explain why that 20 mile per hour speed is something that we've used as a biomarker to look at the impact of long-term neurologic effects from a brain injury and how that has changed. So it is really important that we're in a society today where we literally are not paying attention. So, as I said, 50% of people are having brain injuries from auto accidents. And I'm going to get into a brain injury and what that means. And if you have not experienced a brain injury, I encourage you to get on Facebook and go on a traumatic brain injury Facebook page and listen to the plight of some of these people and the suffering that they endure. And it's my job to try and bring them back. And it's also my job to share this information with you so that you never have to go through something like this. But if something like this does happen, the earlier that you get to making the proper treatment protocols put in place, the better chance you have of not having long-term effects. And if you've ever seen the movie Concussion, it's about football players, and they're fine for years, and it's years later that things start to happen. And I want to explain what starts to happen to the body and to the brain, and how a brain injury or a hit to the head where it looks like everything's okay, and then 6 months, a year, 2 years later, things start to happen. So it's really important to look at some very specific things. If you have had an injury recently, if you've had one for a long time, and also to understand what leaky brain means, because it is not what has been just solely associated with traumatic brain injuries and stroke victims. More and more patients that I'm seeing are having a leaky brain, just like people have a leaky gut. And this is somewhat new information to me because I was getting people that were showing symptoms of a brain injury, yet they hadn't had a brain injury. And the more I looked into the research and the science, and the more we did some basic testing, sure enough, some of the things that have happened to a person that's encountered a brain injury from an e-bike fall, from an auto accident, or even from right here, like cell phones of 76,000 cell phone related injuries were traumatic brain injuries. So, or 13,000 of the 76,000 injuries from cell phones were traumatic brain injuries. So when we start to look at this, we are looking at, on average right now, and moving up to about 3.8 million people a year that have brain injuries. And now we have this term leaky brain that is being caused without even having to have a brain injury. So this is very new science, but it's so critically important because it is a matter of not just life and death, but having a life, a normal life, when so many people that have had these injuries or are going through a leaky brain end up in conditions that are very, very difficult, even with the science that I use. And I'm one of a handful of people that rebuilds a brain. When you go to most neurologists, um, they're treating symptoms. They don't really have at their disposal things to rebuild the brain, to put out inflammation in the brain, to seal the blood-brain barrier, which is like our gut barrier. So leaky gut is obviously from our gut and the barrier of our gut. And we have what is called a blood-brain barrier. And when that is breached or broken, um, there's a whole host of things that start to happen and go on this sometimes rapid decline and sometimes a slower decline, but it really can change someone from having a normal life to a life completely challenged physically, emotionally, and cognitively. So I hope that I give you some pearls of wisdom, some things that can be done, and to take some preventative measures to never even have to go through this. But if you do or have, what can be done and where can you go? So we have cell phones, and people on e-bikes are on cell phones. People in cars are on cell phones. So it's really becoming more prevalent in our society today. If you look at these studies right here, in 2017, there were 751 uh, brain injuries or number of e-bike injuries that occurred in 2017 were 751. Then it almost or more than doubles to 1650. And now we look at just 5 years later, and we're looking at 23,000 injuries a year, and 50% of those are causing brain damage that in a lot of cases is completely changing someone for life. And upwards of 3.8 million people have brain injuries each year, which is almost 10% of the population. And now we throw in this thing called leaky gut, which I'm about to discuss, or not leaky gut, leaky brain, which I'm about to discuss, which makes a brain injury even worse and also can start creating symptoms and neurodegeneration, just like a brain injury, without even having a hit to the head. So, this is just new science, but proven science, and just absolutely beyond factual as to what needs to be done and how we can help and change things. So there was a very interesting thing that started to happen as I started to get more patients that were um, severely depressed. And that's what MDD stands for up here. If you look up here and it says inflammation and symptoms of suicidality, aberrations in inflammatory cytokines have been reported in several neuropsychiatric conditions. It's now pretty much proven that every single mental health condition has inflammation associated with it. And I'm not to say that people are not depressed and going through things because of the society we live in today, the loss of a loved one, a divorce, loss of a home. I've been through all of those things, but the depression and the extra um, activity and damage to our brain is making these conditions from anxiety to depression to obsessive compulsive disorder to manic depressive disorder or massive depressive disorder to schizophrenia to obsessive compulsive disorder, all the way up to dementia and Alzheimer's happening at a more rapid rate and happening to a tremendous amount more people. So this is just absolutely invaluable information. So what happened was I was getting patients that were showing signs of having brain injuries. They were depressed, they had cognitive impairment, they had physical limitations, but no brain injury. And as I dug a little bit deeper into the science and the way I started my practice was I was the head educator for 23 countries for the company that created the Institute of Functional Medicine. But then I had a brain injury myself in 2014 and some work through Harvard Medical and some people that I know brought me back. And I spent the last 7 years really researching uh, neurologic health, but even some of this is brand new to me. So it isn't really out there yet. But what we know now is that inflammation is involved with just about every mental health condition. And that is absolutely everything from anxiety, depression, all the way up. People are having inflammation within the brain. And they found that a higher degree of suicidal ideation was associated with an increased inflammatory index in patients independent of the degree of depressive symptoms. So, what it's saying is, although these people were depressed, irregardless of their depression, the degree of suicidal ideation was more associated with the degree of neuroinflammation. And now we're going to talk about the blood-brain barrier. And before we get into that, and as I said before, um, I'm on Facebook with certain traumatic brain injury groups, and the stories I read are just heart-wrenching sometimes. And what people don't realize is that you have physical alterations, cognitive alterations, and emotional alterations from moderate to severe TBIs. And these limitations or damage to the brain can be subtle and they can be very extreme. And what we realize is that every person is individual. Not every person can be saved, but we can do a lot more than we ever thought possible. But if you've had headaches, migraines that are unbearable, this is what some people are living with. Dizziness and vertigo, just being able to get up and walk, light sensitivity to where just a bright light is almost too much to handle, seizures, blurred vision, your cognitive impairment, inability to concentrate, short-term memory, long-term memory as well. But I mean, really some severe complications from traumatic brain injuries. And this is why I want parents and people to realize that 5 seconds on a cell phone or being on an e-bike without a helmet or not paying attention and one slip and one fall can alter your life forever. And then there's the emotional. I mean, there's post-traumatic stress, personality changes, depression. A lot of people that have brain injuries start to deal with severe depression and a lot of anger. And then on top of that, suicidal ideations. So these are all things that, my gosh, we can now help, but maybe scaring you a little bit, we can prevent. And I just can't emphasize enough, and I encourage you again for the third time, go look at a traumatic brain injury Facebook group and just read what some of these people write. And then think about your sons and your daughters, and think about using your cell phone in the car and how a brief moment in time can change your life forever. So, when we talk about a brain injury, and a lot of people will hit their head, and it doesn't take that much to cause a brain injury. But on average, usually you have to have a hit to the head that's the equivalent of kind of hitting the ground at about 20 miles per hour, which is right around what an e-bike is able to do. But this is where things get really interesting because as I started to look at new patients coming in that had some of these suicidal ideations and some severe cognitive and physical limitations, but didn't have a brain injury, I started to realize that there was inflammation, a lot of neuroinflammation starting to happen. And then when somebody has a brain injury, this blood-brain barrier breaks, and I'll explain what happens when it breaks. But what we're finding out now, and without going through this whole article, is oxidative stress can cause a leaky brain. So what we found out now is that it may not just not it may not it doesn't necessarily now take a 20-mile-an-hour hit to the head, because the oxidative damage that is done, even to young people in certain cases, to this blood-brain barrier means that a 5 or a 10-mile-an-hour hit, a smaller hit, just a bang to the head, can severely just disrupt and break the blood-brain barrier apart. So people that have not had brain injuries are getting a leaky brain. People that have are on their way or starting to maybe get close to having a leaky brain and have a minor head injury, it can turn into something much more severe than we ever thought, and at a much lower impact rate than was previously known to be factual or to be the case. So again, just please understand, we're in a toxic environment, and this is why I really believe mental health has gone up so much, is that we're not exposed to 700 toxins a day, not 7,000, not 70,000, but 700,000 toxins a day. And every time I say this or I use this slide, I'm still amazed, like, oh my gosh, that can't be right. And I double check it and recheck it, and it's factual. And the APA is testing only like 200 of 80,000 chemicals that are in use. And so people from toxins and toxic exposures are getting what is called a leaky brain, and they're getting neuroinflammation in the head. So they're exhibiting signs of a brain injury. They're having palpitations of their heart. They're having anxiety, stress, and mood swings that are massive mood swings, loss of appetite, depression, inability to concentrate, lack of energy, insomnia, a weakened immune system, or a completely altered immune system, as we'll see. And not only an altered immune system, but an immune system that is now turned into an autoimmune condition of the brain. So we're talking about some massive, massive changes that mainstream medical community has yet to really grasp on. But thank God there are a few of us that do understand this. It's why I do free consultations, because I went through it and it was the absolute worst hell of my life. And I never want anybody to have to go through it. And if they have, and you are living with one, I want to be able to do everything I can to help. Whether that's informational, whether you find someone else, whether you come to me, but that you have some solid science and information to understand what's happening and why it can be fixed, and how to know the severity of the damage without having to do a lot. So, again, this is saying that oxidative stress can break the blood-brain barrier. This is so new. We only thought that people that bashed or had a massive blow to the head or from a stroke had their blood-brain barrier broken. And now we're realizing that beyond just the toxic overexposure that's causing inflammation in the brain, it's causing a leaky brain. It's breaking up this blood-brain barrier, which is what is supposed to protect our brain, just like our gut barrier is supposed to protect our body. And in fact, we're going to get into, when the blood-brain barrier is broken, what happens to the body, because we have an immune system in our body and we have an immune system in our brain, and they're not supposed to meet each other. So what happens when they do? The good news is that there are simple things to repair a blood-brain barrier. some of the B vitamins, just deficiencies can cause uh, a blood-brain barrier to be not as healthy or as strong of as a wall. Curcumin is a phenomenal compound that helps seal the blood-brain barrier. Magnesium helps protect the blood-brain barrier. So, somebody that really is savvy with functional neurology knows how to rebuild that barrier back up and reduce that neuroinflammation. Um, and again, a weakened blood-brain barrier due to oxidative stress can become more vulnerable to further damage from a head trauma. I made this assumption months ago, and when I brought it to a few people, it was like, nah, Scott, that's kind of a far stretch, oxidative stress, and then you have a hit in a brain injury, and the brain injury doesn't have to be as severe because the oxidative stress has broken down the blood-brain barrier. And how are you going to put that together? And sure enough, as I started to go deeper into the research and science, and I'm constantly researching and constantly looking at studies, it's absolutely true. So somebody that would take a 20-mile-an-hour hit to cause long-term damage that can happen immediately or months or years later now only needs a 5 or a 10-mile-an-hour hit, and we're off to the races and a whole host of things start happening. So again, it's just so important to realize what we're dealing with. Now, here is a golden nugget. There are a few ways to test for a blood-brain barrier damage. MRI, computed tomography, a CT scan, a lumbar puncture, cerebral spinal fluid tests. None of these things sound very fun. So, here is a very, very easy way to see if you have a disrupted blood-brain barrier. GABA. Maybe you've heard of serotonin, dopamine. GABA is another chemical in the brain. It's a chemical to help calm us down. Um, GABA is too big of a molecule to pass through the blood-brain barrier. So if you just go to the store and buy GABA without having to have an MRI or a needle stuck in the back of your spine, and you start to feel good from that GABA, that's not a good sign because that means that GABA got through the blood-brain barrier. I know it's simple, but it is effective and it is a way to go, do I have something going on upstairs, up here with my brain with a very, very simple test. What happens and what is still mind-boggling to me that most of neurology has not understood this yet, and that's why I'm going to show you several different articles, is that a new way of thinking is that a brain injury becomes an autoimmune disorder. So why does that happen? When that wall, that protective wall, that blood-brain barrier breaks, our body has its own immune system and it gets into the brain. And first of all, it's not supposed to be there. So it doesn't recognize a lot of parts of the brain. So it starts to attack it. Then on top of it, it's seeing inflammation. It's also seeing where we store heavy metals. Lead passes through the blood-brain barrier. So it's seeing heavy metals, it's seeing parts of a body that it doesn't recognize, and it's seeing inflammation. So our immune system starts kind of coding the brain as a foreign invader. Then on top of it, our brain has its own immune system, which is primarily made up of glial cells. We think that we have um, mostly neurons in our head, but we have like 10 times the amount of glial cells, and they're there to either protect our neurons or to clean up the damaged neurons. So what do you think happens when the glial cells, the brain's immune system, is watching the body's immune system, plus the inflammation from the damage, plus the oxidative stress and everything else, it sees all of this going on. Instead of protecting these neurons, it starts cleaning them up because they're damaged. And it thinks that it needs to get rid of them so that they don't pass on further damage. And we see an autoimmune condition begin to emerge. Um, this is another article here where it says a head injury causes the immune system to attack the brain. And I find this so fascinating because it says to date, there are no effective treatments to prevent or reverse the damage sustained after a brain injury. I am living proof of a person that suffered a severe traumatic brain injury in 2014. I could not talk, I could not walk, and I came back 100%. And I used the same therapeutics that brought me back that are even more advanced and improved today than they were 10 years ago when I went through this. In the times that I've worked with different practitioners and I've been on the corporate side and with patients, I have seen people make complete recovery. So to say that there are no effective treatments is absolutely debunked. In fact, there is an article in the National Institute of Health that is not very old that says the only thing that is showing any type of promise and potential is supplementation, and they're just going off supplements in general versus very selected compounds to rebuild the brain. So it is possible, and there are things that can be done. So I wanted to ask ChatGPT and say, hey, I have all these articles. I've been talking about a brain injury becoming an autoimmune disease, and it's really interesting the way it answered. It says it does not inherently become an autoimmune disease, but it can sometimes trigger autoimmune-like responses in the body, leading to long-term complications. Here's how this happens. The blood-brain barrier disruption. Here we go again. Damage to the blood-brain barrier and a protective shield that keeps harmful substances, including our own immune cells, out of the brain. And when it's compromised, these immune cells that don't normally interact with the brain proteins in different parts of brain enter and mistakenly attack brain tissue, leading to inflammation and damage. Well, that sure sounds like an autoimmune condition. Our immune system is messed up and is attacking the brain in parts that it doesn't recognize. Molecular mimicry, that is the whole reason that we develop autoimmune conditions, which are now the third leading chronic disease that we're dealing with. And then chronic neuroinflammation, that after a TBI, there's this chronic neuroinflammation because we have immune systems that are attacking not just our brain's immune system, but our body's immune system, causing prolonged neuroinflammation. And then add on the toxic exposure, and we have got literally brains on fire. And this is why we've had such a rise in mental health conditions over the recent years. And this becomes really, really interesting because even if the blood brain barrier and you take the GABA test and all seems fine, this is some very new research that just came out 3 years ago that suggests that the immune system surveils the brain from a distance and only enters when it finds a problem. Well, how's it going to enter if the blood-brain barrier is sealed? Well, there are some back ways that the immune system can get into the brain. So activity in the brain can be highly detrimental. It can kill neurons and cause swelling, and the brain can't tolerate much swelling. So what it's saying is that the immune system is surveilling the brain from a distance, and it enters when it finds a problem. it can enter in a variety of ways right now. We have a complete broken blood-brain barrier, so the immune system just marches right on in. We have a partially broken or maybe a leaky blood-brain barrier, a leaky brain, and the immune system is seeing inflammation, other things. And so some of these macrophages and different T helper cells start getting into the brain through different holes within the blood brain barrier. And we start to see even more neuroinflammation. And we're in this vicious cycle that is just causing more and more damage to our brains. So when we look at things, this was on another channel on YouTube about the son living with a mysterious syndrome caused by environmental factors. And if you watch the show, it's heartbreaking, and the parents are so incredible with this boy. But we are finding more and more severity in mental health conditions and various strange syndromes happening that seem to be the equivalent of a severe traumatic brain injury just from environmental toxins. So this is, again, is why it becomes so important, is that when oxidative stress starts to happen and starts to break down the blood-brain barrier, so we don't need necessarily a hit for this to happen, and we have to repair it pretty much right away. Or if we have a brain injury, we need to start working on things right away. And if we're able to do that, um, early intervention, there's minimal neurologic deficits. But as we go down and the inflammation gets worse, and we have persistent leaky blood-brain barrier, and then persistent chronic neuroinflammation, and we start to look at things. Now, someone like myself that has to treat a patient, I have to not only rebuild that blood-brain barrier, I have to decrease the neuroinflammation. I have to work on axons that are broken and rebranching and recreating neuroplasticity. I have to get blood flow to get nutrients delivered to certain areas. I have to use certain compounds that can get the parts of the brains where other compounds can't. And some of the compounds can get to other parts of the brain where they can't get to this part. And it gets to be a little bit tricky. Thank God I've spent 7 years figuring this out. But it just causes a lot more damage. And the the sad part is, the good part is that I can still bring people back and can still get significant results. But the sad part is sometimes you just can't bring people back the way that they used to be. And every single person longs to be that person before they took 5 seconds to look at their cell phone or not pay attention while they were on their e-bike or had that accident and hit their brain and their life changed and altered forever. And then there's people going through massive depression and not understanding what's happening to them, and they have a leaky brain. So just that simple GABA test is something that at least gives you an indication or help. And the other thing is, I do all of my consultations free. Every initial consultation is done free, because if I can sit there and at least go, you know what, I think I can work with you. I can work with this person and we can get progress and we can do something. I'm going to do it. But at least hopefully this video is showing you that we are now looking at what was a hot topic being leaky gut for a long time, that I think in the not so distant near future, people are going to start to talk more and more about a leaky brain. But I'm here to tell you that there's things that can be done to repair the blood-brain barrier, to reduce that neuroinflammation. And whether you've had a recent traumatic brain injury, whether you're having certain signs that are indicative of someone who's had a brain injury or going through suicidal ideations or massive depressive symptoms, if we start to just fix some of the inflammation and we start to modulate the immune system and we start to seal off that blood-brain barrier, we can make so much progress with people. And that's my job and my passion, and I've gone through it, and I never want anyone else to have to go through it. So I literally spend as much time with patients as I do researching how to find new ways and new ideas to bring out information to the public, but also new ways to have better treatment. But right now, what I've put together over the last 7 years seems to be working pretty well. So if you ever want to talk to somebody, you can look me up on my website, which is mybrainmechanic.com. You can book a free consultation. My email is there. There's another video that explains autoimmunity in the brain. And you've got somebody that's actually gone through it as well. I think I have to be the only practitioner I know of. I think there's just a handful that treat brain injuries. I mean, literally a handful that really know how to treat a brain injury. And of those, I'm the only one that's really sustained a severe traumatic brain injury. So I understand the psychological component, and it's why I got some other degrees to work in life and health coaching, because we're dealing with the psychological component, and then we're also dealing with the physical component of the brain and rebuilding it and putting it back together so that these things aren't happening. This is really serious stuff, so I hope this video has been helpful and that if you have any questions, you reach out to me. Again, my name is Scott. If you look on my YouTube site, it's My Brain Mechanic. It's very easy to schedule an appointment with me, and I'm more than happy to talk to you and see what can be done. I hope this was really informative, and anyone out there that needs help, you've got a friend that's been through it, somebody that really cares about neurologic health and is willing to do free consultations, which I don't know anybody else that will do. So I hope you reach out to me. Thanks, and I look forward to sharing more videos.